All right, I'm going to try to make my way through this, guys. This is the biggest presentation I've had so far. So my presentation is going to focus on a few different case studies. We're going to walk through the Agile approach that we took in planning and guiding development for these projects. So our approach when we go into an engagement with a client is always unique. One size does not fit all. We do have the same fundamental goals, which is to develop to our deliverables that we've mapped out, and also develop in time, in what we've estimated in time. So the first case study that we talk about, these are all going to be different and unique. The first case study was VMS upgrade to Windows. So it was a migration going from VMS to Windows, and the deliverables were clear. When we had the engagement, when the development team started, we knew what was to be delivered because prior to the engagement, so Don usually goes out prior to the engagement, he will scope out the work that needs to be done. He'll list and estimate the work efforts, break it all up. So it was clear what we had to do when we got out there. Now, when we managed this particular project with Git and GitLab, the second case study that we'll review, the PSG team was hired on for new development. So our team of developers were hired on to take on this new line of code for this customer. This customer already used Visual Studio, and we're starting up in VSTS, or I should call it correctly, as of a couple weeks ago, Azure DevOps, right? All through the presentation, I probably will call it VSTS, but that's synonymous. Case study 3 is a PSG engagement where we were brought on as an extension to the existing development team. This particular group within the company did not use Visual Studio. We brought that with us, but they did use VSTS and ServiceNow. They had the integration from their CRM into VSTS. Okay, so before we go into the case studies, I mentioned Git. Donovan mentioned Git. I think most people in the audience know, but I'm going to take a couple seconds to review that. Git is a version control system. It provides source code management and tracking. It stores this information in a data structure called a repository, and basically it is the starting point of all of our PSG engagements. Typically on every engagement, the first step will be to get the latest set of source code in Git before one change is made. And that's because we can always identify our changes that way through Git. It'll manage them, it's got dates, and you break down into your folders, you have branching, all your files, you have a history to it. I'm not going to go into all the features and functionality. I think that's going to be presented to you later on in this conference, but it is always our starting point for our projects in PSG. So to get into the details of case study 1, which was a migration from VMS to Windows, this particular company had highly customized code. They were very dependent on these customizations, and they were made by one developer. That developer was then retiring. It's not a story that we don't hear often. It happens. They weren't deep in the bench in knowledge. So part of our engagement was not only to migrate the code to run in Windows, but we helped them do their UAT testing, which we also incorporated staff training in that. We were on site to move their code into production, and eventually we came into a position to help them support it until they got a team together that could support and maintain their application. This project, I said we used GitLab for, so the GitLab tracking, we used tickets, labels, and filters on that. So we talked about Git being the repository for information, and GitLab being a web-based service that provides online project management console. So it's the UI to the Git. So looking at some of the information that GitLab tracks, attaching a file, pretty standard stuff there. being able to launch an email to notify somebody that you have a ticket out there for them or you want to communicate in some way. You can do the @ sign and their name. They're a team member in this project, and it launches an email. Assigning work to somebody. You have milestones. Something that I used heavily in this project was labels. Labels could be used to group like tickets that you need to report on at a later time. It could also be used to define what phase you are in the development process for that particular piece of work. In this project, we used it for both. So we had different labels to define our workflow system, to define what stage we were in development. Were we in requirements? Are we developing? Are we waiting for a build? Is it over in QA testing? Is it done, completed? So you can use those labels and track your work and report on it easier. Also in a project, you might find yourself with requests that come in that are not truly bugs or work efforts. They are enhancements. So you want to be able to report that kind of thing. What was a bug? What was our work tickets? And what are enhancements? This is the way you would do that in Git. You use the GitLab tickets issues for it. So communication is key in any project. Particularly this project, knowing that the developer is retiring, we had to educate the staff that's coming on to help maintain that, and users, because they had such a dependency on the developer who was there from the beginning of time that they didn't even know their daily processes were so dependent on them. So a case in point is someone will say, well, I'm running this reconciliation, it doesn't work. I just went over and asked X about it and it was fixed. What did I do? So we would take the time in that situation to write the ticket up, have it in there, but also write up and attach a document on how it was fixed. So now you have a knowledge base in there as well. So you're helping, we want to partner with them to help them be able to maintain their system going forward. So in creating all the tickets, we have this big list of tickets in here, which is great. It's a list. We see all of our labels on there. We see that we can filter this list by open and closed items. We have some things we can, sort it and filter it on assignee or a typical label. That's great. It's great to have for reporting purposes. You have the whole list in front of you. You got the latest things, but maybe not so easy to hold daily stand-up meetings and say, what's the status of what you're working on, right? In that case, we used a GitLab Kanban view. So to drive development on a daily basis, we would use a board like this. It's taking the same information you saw in the list, but it's using those labels that we had and which phase of development it's in and displaying it on a Kanban board. This made it very easy to say, okay, in my doing column, here's our stand-up meeting. What are you working on? What did you complete yesterday? What are you working on today? And do you have any hurdles? Same speech that you get, Donovan was saying, for the Scrum Master, but it truly works. And having something visual like this gives you a better idea of what work is still out there to be completed and in what phase it's in. This Kanban board, like I said earlier, we could create labels. You can configure how many phases of development you have by those labels. So in our case study summary 1, we had the Windows migration. We used Git to manage our source. We used GitLab for Kanban board for development lifecycle. And we also use the GitLab list to actually create a cross-reference with their internal CRM package. So their users, when we went into a support mode with them, their users would create a ticket. That project manager, when they would look at it and say, that's goes to development. So it would launch an email to us, and we would create a ticket in GitLab for it using the cross-reference to their CRM package. And this way now, we can meet once a week. We could say what's closed, what's open, prioritize list of outstanding work, and that was a way to communicate what was going on and support them on an ongoing basis. So they were not, they didn't have a development team. They were not a Windows shop. So some of the things that we've learned there is we don't want to come in and say, you have to run it this way. You have to build a team out. We want to build them for success. We don't want to overwhelm them with a tool set that may be a little too much for them. We want to work with you to come to the best solution for your company. They needed the knowledge transfer, being able to attach the tickets, being able to have tickets, have them reference them at any time, sort them was great learning experience and something they could go to after we were no longer working with them. And also, we partnered for success with them. And what I mean by that is we help them position themselves to maintain their application for themselves going forward. So that was our first case study. We'll go into case study 2, which in this one, we did a Visual Studio Team Services. We were brought on as a development group for a project. It was a new project, and they wanted to, we got into development a little bit early, very aggressive time deliverable. So we started out, we got the SCRUM team together. We needed to write requirements. We needed to create features and stories. We had to estimate the work effort, so-called sizing a story, plan release dates, and develop the plan. What that looks like is a hierarchy like this. So your first thing in here would be your epic story. That's your overall project, or one big piece of it. A feature is a feature of that project, which then breaks down into user stories, which are smaller chunks of work efforts to create that particular feature. So this is kind of the hierarchy of that, and actually we can create tasks from the stories. This type of view of the hierarchy is good to give to business because you can track your work from a higher level. They don't necessarily want to know all the tasks that are involved in completing the work efforts, but they do want to see how far am I in the project, right? So you'll have different states of done of stories that will roll up into features. So this will give you an idea of how complete you are in that particular feature. As we were writing requirements for this company, the requirements were changing. There was no clear finish line here. We were to get started because there was an aggressive timeline, but things were going to change. We could expect change. Well, we did our due diligence with creating what features and stories we knew were going to be there that we could work on, and we planned on releasing them and sharing them with other departments that may have had to interface with us. So when you do that in your planning process, you are going to plan for the things that you know are subject not to change as much and that have dependencies, other departments have dependencies on that they need to start testing. So in one of Donovan's, in his presentation, he mentioned that you want to get, and when you're prioritizing, you want to get stuff done that will go out so you can test immediately and get feedback. So getting those deliverables, getting them iterative and out to somebody so that they can start testing and give you immediate feedback gave us a better starting point for when requirements changed to react to them. In the actual story template, the VSTS story has a lot of different information it'll track. Just some of these features here, some of them are pretty standard with descriptions and titles and the person to assign to, status. It's interesting in here that we have some historical audit trails of changes. That is a really cool feature because inevitably you're going to question, when did that happen? When did these changes take place? Having this history is great, and this tab here makes it very easy to walk through it with dates and times and the person who's made the changes. The link to other work items is great when you have features and stories you can combine together. They have dependencies on each other and you link them to it. There's also attaching files, the action menu. You also have the emailing feature, again, where you can do the @ and the team member's name. It will launch an email and you can communicate whatever you have to communicate in there to them. All of this information that we are seeing on this board here, on this ticket, is also available to query. So some of the planning information that we have in here with story points and the priority, they're pretty important pieces of information. Now I can go back at any time in their queries and I can search for whatever I need, break this down. All these fields are available. Story points and priorities is something that typically will always be bumped to the top when you are searching for work to do. When you're planning your work, you're going to want to know how big is your work effort and what priority is it to the business group. When we are driving the development with the actual Scrum team, we are going to, in this project, work from a Kanban board. The release board that I showed you earlier shows you a high-level view of the overall work. In the daily stand-up meetings, we want to drive individual work. We want to make sure they're working on the right priorities, and we want to be able to show progress. Grooming stories is the way that we take one of the bigger stories, break down into smaller stories that will fit into an iteration and that you can create tasks for. This is what we would have our daily stand-up meetings in VSTS. Our Scrum team would look at our board and we would say what stuff is in new, development, build, done. This again is configurable. VSTS allows you to define your development phases and you would push your story accordingly. Daily stand-up meetings and weekly customer meetings and reports are a must for all of our projects, the PSG team. This is a standard that we do. Our weekly customer meetings, we review the report that we put out, so you not only get it in writing, but we review it. You get to ask questions if you don't understand something's on there. And we also include hours that we have burned down versus hours we've estimated, giving you an hours remaining. In summary, what we learned for this case study was we came on as a development team. We used Visual Studio and started their first VSTS project. So this team, we were the first team to spearhead this effort with them in VSTS. We wrote requirements, we planned releases, and we built a Kanban board. We were able to develop our work, communicate the statuses, and also tell them when they were ready to release the features. What we learned with this company is that we had to be adaptable. We knew going in that we were going to have changes in these requirements because we did not start with a clear finish line here, but if you break down your work into smaller pieces, you were able to be more agile in your approach and react to those changes coming in. Our case study 3. This was a company who used VSTS, integrated with ServiceNow. The particular team that we joined did not use Visual Studio. That's something that we brought onto that team. Some of the management for that team was very interested to see us bring in Visual Studio and have them start using it and bring developers onto it. But the beauty of that is we could show them how they could use it and the advantages of using Visual Studio, but they didn't have to. They didn't have to, and we could all work simultaneously and harmoniously in the project with having the 2 levels of development. In this particular project, we were brought on to work down their backlog. There were, let's say there was 20 stories in the backlog, and They had them sized for us. This should be about 200 hours, those 20 stories. How long do you think it would take for 200 hours? So that was the engagement coming on. Well, going through that, we had the opportunity to bring on a business analyst who is a subject matter expert in the industry. So we were extremely fortunate to have her, and we soon found out that backlog was not really sized correctly. So that's one thing, and you can't look at a backlog at a number of stories because the work efforts on those stories are just so variable. Some could be a one-day job, a week job. Some could be, it could be this feature that we have to write that takes a month and a half. So you really have to look at it as a work effort and not a number of stories that are in the backlog. So she went to work grooming the backlog, and then we were by priority that the customer said these are the most important features to us. That's how we started to attack the backlog there. We estimated how long that particular story was going to take us. This company had a very mature process in the way the stories and the work developed. They would first start it in ServiceNow as an idea, and it has its whole workflow system on how it gets approvals and moves to the next. So they were very mature in their processes in how the work got into the backlog, and also how they needed the environment to be set up, the development environment to be set up to branch. So they branched on work orders, and everything was its separate environment, its separate branch, and then it would have to wait until it got through all the stages of development and QA, UAT, and in production before it merges back into the main branch. So, a little bit different than what Donovan talked about earlier, and his way is super cool, and I would love to see it work in practice and want to work towards something like that, but everybody's different. We came on as an extension to this development team, so these processes that are in place, we're going to go ahead and follow. We can always discuss, hey, this could be an improvement here. There might be some wiggle room here, but certainly we're not redeveloping how they work. We're brought on to work on the backlog, and that was our main focus. And every place you can see these three samples here, they've all done this a little bit differently. Estimating release dates. So regardless of going back and grooming the backlog, what the business team wants to know, they're not thinking in the amount of points, they're not thinking in the amount of stories. They want to know, when can I release this work effort? So we have to plan out our releases depending on our estimates. And we also, for our development team, developed in sprints. So we'll take a look at some of that. Here's the backlog of stories. So it's got a whole bunch of information on here, right? With our cross-reference to ServiceNow, what kind of portfolio it's in, the descriptions, and here's your ranking and your story points. You have a bunch of different statuses. Like I said, they had a complete workflow system in their ServiceNow, which you're able to add and share that information between ServiceNow and the STS. So all this information that you put into a ticket is available for you to run queries against and report on. In our planning, we needed to create a release schedule. A release schedule depended on the priority of work. We groomed the story, we've created and estimated smaller work efforts for it, and have planned out what sprint it would be in. So at that point, we are able to create target dates. So in here, the report that we had to create for business was, here is my feature. This is the current state it's in. This is the target release date. Here's when it should complete development, when it should complete QA, and this is when it should complete UAT. They had monthly releases, so it was, you knew if it passed UAT at a certain date, it would be eligible for a particular release date or target release date for production. So that is an effort that you have to work with your development scrum teams, your UAT team, because that was different, and coordinate the dates between all the teams of when, get their commitment of when they could finish this work. But it is doable, and part of the features on a feature card, these are all target dates, and you can create reports like this for your business execs. The release hierarchy, again, it would be your feature, your stories, and in here we showed a little bit in this slide. What I'm showing you here is per feature, if I break this down, this has 4 stories. Those 4 stories are in multiple states, multiple phases of development. Some are QA done. One has not been started because it's still being in prioritized. That means that someone's still working on requirements for it. And then some are in development doing. It could also list the sprint that these particular stories have been worked on. It really kind of narrows down your release planning. You know exactly what pieces need to fit in there. You know when they were worked on. You know what state they're in. Developing in sprints. Now we're getting down to your Scrum team and the information that you'll use for them. Developing in sprints, we took team capacity, and that would be this little screenshot here with all the members on your team. You're saying, how many hours are you devoting to this sprint? You might be a shared resource. You might have vacation days. I'll be able to write that down. But how many hours a day are you committing to me for solid development or solid testing? And you put in those hours, put in the days that they'll work, and it knows the duration of your sprint and calculates how many points you can assign to that particular person. So now when I'm planning the actual sprint itself, if you have 100 hours to give me, I can give you tasks or stories worth 100 hours. Now what we do is assign work. So from our story, we break it down into tasks. Donovan was talking about this earlier. You want to make your tasks small enough so that you can monitor, am I behind? Are they behind? Are we really going to be able to make this commitment? If you make one task for each story or don't make any tasks, right? I don't know. Every day you check in with them. Hey, you working on that? Yep, that's what I'm working on. That's what I'm working on. You don't know you're behind until a day after you miss your deadline. With tasks, you do know, because when you're running the board, you're saying, okay, I have 4 tasks out there. Each one is 1 hour, and you are marking down your burn down time on that task. I started off with 1 hour. How many hours do I have remaining? So 1 might not have been a good example. Let's say 10, and you go in the next day, and they put in 2 hours on that task. Now I have 8 hours remaining. So if I'm in the 3rd day of a 5-day sprint, and I have 20 hours for that person, and they have 5 hours to give me a day, they're behind. I can evaluate that already. I know you're behind because you told me you have 5 hours a day, and you got 20 hours of work left here for this week, so something's wrong. How do we make that up? How do we adapt? How do we change for that? So this is what this chart over here is telling you. It will give you how many, it'll tell you if I've overloaded somebody, I've assigned more points than this person can possibly finish, or I'm down to a point where they have more hours remaining on their board than they have left in their sprint. So this board is always good to use in a daily sprint meeting, because it gives you an idea. If they're red, you immediately draw your eyes there and go, we're off. You don't even have to add up the points that they have. This is a visual that tells you that. The task views, this is a really cool thing to use in your Scrum meetings. So in the daily stand-ups, you can sort this. You can sort this by story, so what work effort you're talking about, or I can sort it by people. And I can say, okay, Jane, what are you working on today? This will be sorted out by Jane, all of her work down here. What are you working on? Is it in the active column? Have you done your burn down on your ticket? You said you worked on that, but it has 0 hours that you worked on it, and you still have the same remaining hours here, so please update your stories. It's a good way to check that, yes, people say they're working on it, but did they move it into the right columns? Are they representing it? Are they using the burn down? And you can sort it again by story and people. What that does for you is to meet with each person. It's great because you get to talk to them about their work efforts. You do it by story, you're able to see, am I on target with the story here? Or do I need to make some changes to make sure that we make up some lost time? Burn down chart basically is telling you how you are doing in your sprint. When we talk about the tasks that we've assigned to our Scrum team, they are marking down the remaining hours. This is what's driving this burn down chart. You start off the sprint with all your assigned work. So it's a really bad idea to start a sprint without all your work. So when someone says, yeah, that should be ready in 2 days, your BA wants to tell you, I'll have that to you. No, your deadline is, my sprint starts here. Whatever's in the backlog that's ready for me, that's what we have to work on. So, I mean, you get in trouble, and I think this was mentioned in an earlier presentation. You make a bad decision and saying, yeah, I'll accept that later. All these inconsistencies start happening with your burn down, and you take on more points than you can finish. So in the beginning, we start with all of our points, and that is calculated, like we said, we calculated per person how much time they had to give us for the sprint. Well, for the overall sprint, all the accumulated hours for each person is summed up, and that gives us our capacity for the sprint, our total capacity. So it starts off at the top line here. It calculates an ideal trend, how much we should be burning down by day. And we did really good. You're doing good, you slope off here. So what's going on? Did someone forget to update something? Did we take on more points in the middle? Did we have some bugs? I mean, it's a visual that clues you in to have those conversations with your team. And it also lets you know, okay, this says I've got 5 more days of my sprint, but I have 200 hours left in tasks. Am I going to make it? So another chart that just gives you a good tracking point and a good monitoring tool for how you're doing to make your deadlines. Reporting. You know, I took the time to show all the information on the card, and I did that because this section here in the reporting in VSTS lets you create your own queries. So all of that information is available to you, and you can create your own queries. They have the filters, so it starts off using something like this. Makes it very easy for you to do. You don't have to be a DBA to write your queries in here. It's driven by this query editor, which allows you to select the work type. That's one of the fields that I used in here. I made it a user story, but you can track the historical work, you can track tasks, features, what have you, whatever you need to be reporting on. You can add other filters and criteria in there, whatever your particular needs are for that report. You also not only create that, but you say what columns I need on there, and then you can position them in whatever order you want them to be in. So from the original backlog, here's columns that I've picked, and they match all my criteria. I filtered on them, and now I can say, I want to take that information and make a chart out of it, right? So here's my results panel. Now I just flip over to this tab here, and I can create a chart. These are done. I give it what to sort on, what to group on, and it creates the charts for me. So it's really easy to pull together some graphics for reporting in VSTS. So the SCRUM Team Communication that we used for this particular case study, we had daily stand-up meetings, we had the story grooming meetings, the sprint planning, end of sprint demos, and weekly customer meetings. The end of sprint demos, I think, it was mentioned earlier, really kind of critical. And I've been calling them handoff demos in a lot of situations. Other teams are like, well, an end of sprint demo means nothing to me. But if they know that this is work being handed off to them, the attendance automatically increased. So it is really important, especially when it's more complicated code. It's a bigger feature that they're getting. Having the developers and or QA person who's worked on that intimately give the next team, which would be UAT in this case, some background on it really made things work quicker. So in summary, case 3 was we were a development team. It was an extension of their existing development team. We used an integrated Visual Studio with VSTS integrated with ServiceNow. We did requirements, releases, sprints, and reporting. What we learned in this engagement was the backlog. Backlog is, the root of the core of all the work. And you can't look at it, like I said earlier, as in a number of stories. That's the wrong view. You really have to look at the work efforts. You really have to analyze what's in there, because sometimes if it's an older thing in the backlog, someone will say, well, this is just like it. We should probably do this at the same time. Now people might add on to the requirements but never increase the size. So backlog is very important to look at and have estimates, because it helps provide the business team an idea of how to prioritize it. They might prioritize something differently if they know that it takes 2 months to do versus they can get 4 things out which are just equal in importance in 4 weeks. So the backlog is critical for business decisions. Sprints. We kind of fooled around with sprints in this team. We started off with 2 weeks, and the teams felt like they could not get enough done. There was too many meetings in the planning, because you got to plan for the requirements to start the sprint, and you got to plan the sprint, what's your capacity, and we had to have the demos at the end. So we increased it. We increased it to a month, which is the 4 weeks, and I know I heard that probably wasn't something that Donovan would suggest for us, but in that sprint, 1 month sprint, we planned on 3 weeks of iterative development, right? So we're developing, passing it to QA. We're developing, passing it to QA. But inevitably, we're still, at the end of 3 weeks, development is still pushing to QA, right? So they get backed up. QA gets backed up. So one of the ways we started to get around that was we loaded up developers with 3 weeks worth of development. The last week of development, we kind of had a cutoff. Developers had to complete their stuff within the 3 weeks, right? And then QA could catch up with us, right? Catch up with the development team, finish their testing, and the developers would now start grooming stories for the next sprint. So the first day of the next sprint, we should be able to get off the ground running. Developers are also leaving time open for remediation work. Anything coming back from QA that says, hey, that's not right, this is a bug. So that 1 week cushion there helped us complete all of our stories and not have to split them into the next sprint. So that's kind of how we played with that to make sure that we were getting our stories completed within a sprint. Reporting. Love the way that you're allowed to be so flexible in VSTS with the reporting. We could satisfy the needs of the exec group with the hierarchies, which we could target release dates, and we could say you can have this functionality in here, this is when it's going to be done in the phases. And we could get down to the low level of tasks for the Scrum team, and we can report on how many bugs did you have to this particular work effort. And QA teams, they had the test suites, and we could run how many bugs per their tests. So it really allows you a lot of flexibility by giving you the querying, that you can create your own level of reporting depending on who your audience for that report is. So in all the case studies that we reviewed today, they were all unique. They were all kind of scalable. They did not come in needing the same things from our team. They used different tool sets, but that's the beauty of our job in the services group, professional services group, because all of our customers are unique. And we all have different implementations to help them succeed what they're looking to do. Version control is one of the standards that we do, same for all of our customers using Git. We want to always drive results, whether you're using VSTS, whether you're using GitLab, your Kanban, your Sprint, we're driving results. We have target deliverables, and we're going to get you there, and we're going to let you know, we're going to communicate the status and how you're doing making those goals. So that is it for my slides, and I guess I'm open to question and answer. How large was the code base, number of files, directories, and file size you merged into Git? Boy, they've all been different, but I want to say that we're talking thousands, and I'm going to look for some confirmation from out there. Yeah, I would say that's pretty standard estimate there. A lot of the projects have at least, multiple folders and thousands of files of code. Can you speak on how you kept improving the process, estimating tasks, dealing with delays, priority changes, and resource allocation? I'm going to put it down for that one because inevitably you have things to improve at the end of each sprint. We did talk about it as a team, and one of the ways we would start that conversation is like, what worked good for you guys in here? What do you think that we really did good? What are we struggling with in here? That's when we came into the conversation that 2 weeks was not enough time. We also struggled with some of the things that QA was presenting to us. They were getting very granular in their testing, and it did not seem like we were on the same page here. What they were reporting, they were asking a lot of questions. So we talk as a team. They're struggling with some of the reporting, and what we decided is, you know what? On some of these more complicated things that we're developing where we might have struggled, we are including our unit testing. All developers need to post their unit tests in the tickets before it goes over to QA, right? So they can see how you've tested it. We also give a handoff to QA. So if we've got a bunch of things that we've developed and they're going into the QA queue and ready for testing, if it warrants it, we're going to have a little meeting amongst our own Scrum team and say, this is what we did in here, and we're going to show you what we did. This is some of the hurdles I fell on. Why not share that information? Why let each team struggle? Share what you've seen and help your teammates. Priority changes. So after a sprint starts, it's done. You're started. You're committed. You're committed to delivering what you've committed to in the beginning of the priority. Now, bugs come up in priority. But what we did in the sprint is I took a percentage of a developer's time. If you have just worked on a project, and I'll give you a true life example, there was a requirement that they wanted to add the option on their reports for their automated end of day, let's call it, to add CSV as an option on all these reports. Well, it was 20 reports. So as we were creating them, we needed to estimate, and we needed to create the priority on how we're pushing it over to QA, right? We needed also to show QA how we did that. What should you be testing on here? What are some of the features? If you run this pre-night audit, then you're going to overwrite your own work. So we kept improving and communicating the process to each other. Dealing with delays and resource allocation. The allocation we set right up in the beginning of the sprint. Where are you guys? Do you have any vacation planned on here? There's the holidays. Let's take into consideration holidays. All of that is defined ahead of time. So we're probably pretty good on the resource allocation. Now, one of the other points I was going to make with the big project with the 20 stories is that if the developer had worked on those 20 stories previously, and now they're all in QA, and QA still has to catch up on like 15 stories, we're going to create in that sprint a story that gives you a certain percentage of time for remediation, right? Because I'm anticipating that. I'm anticipating that developer just handed over this big chunk of work to QA they're still working on. You can bet he's going to have a percentage of his time that he's going to need for remediation. So why not create a work ticket for that, anticipating that? Otherwise, if I load him up front with new work, he's going to be behind. He's not going to be able to make those commitments, and he's going to fail on those commitments because he needed to do remediation work. So you kind of, when you're planning the sprint, think about that. Think about the remediation work that someone might have to address, and give them a chunk of time in that iteration to do that work. How do you resolve the issue where QA doesn't have work in the beginning of a sprint and too much at the end? Well, it only happens the first time. So usually after one sprint, QA is loaded at the end. They're starting the next sprint, finishing up work, right, as you're moving on to new development. Also in QA, it's not like you don't have any work just because the developer didn't give you anything. You are reviewing those requirements and you are writing test cases. You are creating what you're going to run when that work is handed to you. So there should rarely be a time where they don't have something to look at. Why a 3-week turnaround for QA? Why not less than 24-hour turnaround? Well, we haven't really gotten the stories down to a small enough chunk that we've been able to turn them around in that period of time. They are doing very granular tests, which require negative testing for results, a little bit of anything around it that it might have touched. It just is not enough turnaround time for them. In all of your case studies, and from your own personal experience, what would you recommend for the number of QA staff and the best implementation of QA? Wow. I've actually looked this up several times, and everyone has an opinion about it, right? I'm going to say it depends on your QA staff, and I have some QA experts out there that I've worked with in other projects. What's their experience level coming in? Okay? What is your developers? You have to look at some of your turnaround. You have to monitor what's going on in your sprints, and you'll know if you need more QA. Are you constantly backed up? Did you not estimate this right? Or do you overload them and you need more? But typically, I would say right now we run with a 2 to 1. 2 developers to 1 QA person right now in that particular project we were talking about. For the migration project from VMS to Windows, how was testing done to ensure all system functionality was migrated? So that was a really interesting testing effort because we did our own QA testing, right? So when we migrated sections of work, it was the printing, it was the sorting, it was the batch files, let's say all the different segments. And we did that per our stories, per our requirements, our deliverables that we had defined. But then when we moved into testing, we moved into a UAT testing. So we hosted that UAT testing, and we had a QA person there with them. They ran through their daily processes. It helped train them in Windows. It really was the same navigation, just slightly different, but it helped train them and also provide really good feedback and thorough testing for us on the application. So we got the customer involved with it. Thank you.